It is my great pleasure and absolute honour to introduce to you a colleague of mine who I have had the pleasure of working with and knowing for 20 years. Clare Cooper, who is a senior lecturer in design at Sydney University and has come to speak with us and kick off our first keynote for NIME2025. Clare is going to be talking. I'm a bit out of breath for some reason. I'm clearly nervous. Clare is going to be speaking to us in a provocative sense and speaking to us as in a provocative way. She wants to get us thinking about our future. And she does that because she is an expert in a set of methodologies within design called futuring. And there's a Miro, if we don't already know about it, that was sent out on the forum, also via email, and there'll be a QR code on if you haven't already logged in. So please get in there and participate, as this is participatory in many respects. And the other thing, and also alongside being an incredible expert in all things futuring, Clare is also an amazingly accomplished musician and facilitator of experimental music. I'm sure many of us already know this. So really, really fantastic combination of transdisciplinary, I think, personally, and I hope you agree. I'm sure you'll agree. But yes, thank you so much, Clare. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you, Pia. When I'm introduced as a design academic, I'm always nervous that I've got a huge typo on my first slide, so I think we're okay. Thank you so much, Pia, and for Charles as well for the invitation. I acknowledge that the majority of this work was done at the University of Sydney, which is built on the ceremonial grounds of the Gadigal, and sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and especially recognise their ferocious social justice leadership over centuries. And I especially want to thank the Ngunnawal and Ngambri for welcoming us on their country. Where to today? So we'll be looking at some histories, we'll be doing some braiding, and then we'll be jumping into some NIME community futuring. I want to also just flag with those of you who need reminding that we do need to adhere to the ASRA from the year 2033, now that we're in 2035. The attention span reset alarm is going to go off every 8 minutes during content delivery to cue a reset, especially good for those who didn't undertake that digital detox that was mandated in the late 2020s. I'll be implementing this as part of my keynote in accordance with the GBASEM, the governing body for attention span extension methods decree of 2033. So we've been doing this for 2 years. We should really be used to this now. So as is standard practice, please use the alarms to close your eyes and take a breath. Wiggle either your nose or your toes and imagine someone you love or your favourite tree. For about 20 seconds. So we've done this for 2 years. We should really know this by now. And I'll be using tracks from my Martian chamber music duo Germ Studies that's been operating since around 2003 to cue these. So that's my duo with Chris Abrahams playing the very ancient Guzheng and the almost as ancient DX7 synthesizer. It's going to sound a little like this. Choose your nose or your toes, not both. We know that that doesn't actually help. So into some histories. When I was invited to give a keynote at NIME, back in 2025, 10 years ago, I did say yes on the condition that I could return a decade later, now in 2035, to reflect on some of the major driving forces of change and ways of collaborating as a global network of passionate creators. In 2025, some of you questioned the choice of an improvising harpist and design academic. Also, why choose an acoustic musician who plays a guzheng, 2,500-year-old Chinese zither, and a harp which has been traced back to 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia. Sure, I did some residencies at Stime Institute in the early 2000s, dabbling with some Max MSP, tilt sensors, sticking car speakers into the harp to try and find the resonant G spots. But my core performance tools are hardly new interfaces. Between 2001 and 2020s, my main attempts to challenge the cultural baggage of the harp, which I found it to be a huge weight on my shoulders, and to expand the vocabulary of my instruments was either to record and mimic rusted farm machinery and Australian birdsong. And at other times, I just donned a leotard and tap danced around them. This was from Liquid Architecture a little while back. Looking from the outside at what I'd done over those 2 decades back then, beyond making experimental music, starting the Now Festival, the Splinter Orchestra in Sydney, which was a large improvising ensemble that started around 2001, and then the Splinter Orchestra, the sister orchestra in Berlin around 2009. One would have seen possibly a nonsensical but entangled mess. All of my activities, including design projects, university teaching, and setting up a space called Frontyard in 2016 in response to the Brandis Arts Cuts back then. You would have seen some visible crissing and crossing to an outsider, but for me, they all shared the same spirit. And I spent almost 7 years trying to articulate and celebrate this entanglement in my PhD research on context-responsive collaborative music making and how this intersects with the field of design, especially because design seems to be able to celebrate the language of co-evolving problem spaces and solution spaces rather than arriving at a perfect composition, a perfect answer. But it was only when I was asked to speak to the theme of entanglement at that NIME conference back in 2025 that I identified that there really were 3 main threads moving through all of the things that I possibly had ever done. And those were community, improvisation, and the third one is activism. That's my preferred term, but depending if I'm asking someone for funding, it's often advocacy. In 2025, most of my research and practice was based on collaborative futuring, which was mostly to encourage people to tell stories of possible, not always desirable futures, to help find new ways into current predicaments. And now that I'm back here again in 2035, age 54, looking at 3 decades of my practice outside of, in adulthood, my main goal is really to offer some tools and also a digital space for you to try futuring on as a community, to share what means the most, what drives us to keep creating, and what needs to be possibly more proactively protected, fought for, and what things might hold us back, and what makes connection harder. I recall that that particular NIME 2025 was held during an incredibly scary time for many of us. And it was just before Donald Trump's son assassinated him at the launch of the Trump Industries solid gold toilet flushing button event, which actually set off, I don't know if you remember, a spate of world leaders being assassinated by their children, mostly linked to inaction on climate, but some just old school vengeance for bad parenting. It was a time when Australian universities were charging international students around 50,000 Australian dollars a year for design degrees. And for a conference like this, it used to cost around 800 Australian dollars to attend. I don't know if you remember that, in addition to travel and accommodation costs. And many could not be part of the conversation. When did this change and why did it change? Oops, jumped ahead too far. There were many ways of measuring our successes that didn't serve us. Metrics were imposed on the community, often by institutions. And just getting stuff done, putting fires out was hard enough, rather than actually coming together to advocate for new metrics that actually served us and made us more joyful in the way we created. So H indexes, citations, paywall articles were definitely held above organizing gigs or tours or actually sharing music or sharing process. Non-traditional research outputs in 2025 were bizarre, multi-headed creatures that had to be fought for every single time. When did this change? So to the point where now we're at a point where NTROs are absolutely held in high regard. How do we do it? And did NIMEs gather to advocate for this? Were we allocating 2 days a year outside of the 1 week conference to actually come together to fight for things like universal basic income or NTRO recognition? Just a little seed there. Oh, I've jumped ahead. Sorry. I think I've deleted a section. No, my main response to entanglement in 2025 was to think about intention and connection over time. To visualize this and imagine holding this, I drew on my Celtic roots and pictured the braid, but particularly a braid as held against the scalp of somebody. Maybe it's a screaming child who you love very much, or some kind of super hairy dog, but absolutely not just braided away from something else, but being anchored to something. So I don't know, any show of hands, anyone who's actually attempted a braid? Even, oh, look at that. Okay, great. The rest of you, that's your homework. So you start by selecting a section. You have a shape in mind, you have a particular intention in mind. You select a section and you hold 3 key parts. You're sort of deciding how much to involve, how much to leave out. You're starting to assess these as you go. Sometimes you accidentally introduce more threads, but you each time you anchor the braid as you move between the 3 parts. The threads are interwoven, anchored, welcome, accidental, intended and unintended shapes happen. Can we braid sonic futures, friendships, collisions, rhythms? I've been braiding community, improvisation, and advocacy in almost everything I've turned my hand to over the 3 decades. I think particularly back, I was not so lovingly looking back on my PhD thesis last week, and I was reflecting on how I was trying to cultivate more context-responsive improvisation using design framing. And I can see another braid here, quite accidentally. There's definitely a theme emerging for me. In this research, I was trying to mess with the codified tropes of improvisation and trying to disturb social, temporal, and physical contexts in this for the players, for the listeners, for the organisers, and try to zoom out to a sort of hyperobject of this community over time, passing questions. So it's in the research and practice of, here we go. Where I got to around 2025, it had been about 10 years of practicing futuring. And it's in this particular practice that I can see the application and usefulness of this framing, of the braiding framing. And so I've spent some time in the lead up to the conference preparing some sketches and a mirror board to offer this community to articulate and navigate some future possibilities this week and in the coming years if you enjoy it and feel like it's useful. Futuring is absolutely not predicting futures. It's a way of combining informed projections with imaginative critical design to invite NIMEs, organisations, communities and individuals to think differently about our current predicaments. This process can help those involved step back from moments of panic and proactively design steps to change things for the better, not 20 years from now, but from today. And there's a particularly wonderful scholar, Sohail Ayatollah, who talks about futuring not being a pretty picture on the wall that we just hope we get to, but something that requires an active backcasting, working out what toolkits we need to avoid some of the worst case scenarios, whether we end up needing them or not. It's a creative, juicy process we can all enjoy. You may be familiar with the futures cone. Have any of you seen this before? And all of these P's, I'm going to break the microphone if I say them all, so just read them in your brain. But I particularly like, there were students of mine in 2018 when we were working on some futuring, where they were exploring, in 50 years' time, there was an international travel ban caused by a global pandemic. And they were exploring personal uses of technology in this particular future. And they were all rolling their eyes saying this is an insane scenario. It's completely preposterous. They designed really quite beautiful speculative probing prototypes around nostalgia and travel. And I just wish I could go back to that class. Well, back in the pandemic and COVID, I wish I could have seen that class again to say, let's go with some of these designs, or perhaps they did. But it was kind of crazy that I think it was less than a year later that we were living under those circumstances. So I do like Joros Forest, but I don't like the Futures Cone because it does just ask us to spring forward with no run-up. And so in my research, I've developed a few different tools for futuring. Most of them are visual. Some of them are used, I don't even necessarily call them futuring, but they're used in the first class with my students of visual communication or Masters of Interaction Design, where they introduce themselves in 5 years' time and then build back to why they even started that degree at all, or why they're pursuing what they're pursuing right now. And it lubricates that that kind of thinking of being where you might want to actually be or where you're afraid of being, and building back from there rather than being inside the dark hole and trying to figure out how you're going to climb out of it. The double variable method is not my original method, but it is a wonderful one if you ever want to look it up. Galtung established it in the 90s, and it's been widely used in business, mostly profit-driven futuring. But that particular one, when I first saw it, so it's just a 2x2 exploring 4 different scenarios rather than a good future, bad future. And the thing I loved about that one is it made me feel like I was in the original Tron, looking at 360 degrees of possibilities rather than the good future, bad future roads. So also recommend having a look at that one. But the one we're going to have a look at today, and this is one I developed in this realization that I needed a run-up to futuring, that it was more helpful rather than starting from the now and trying to jump forward. Like you know, if we all did that in a, what's it called? What's the race we have to jump over things? Hurdles, right? You need a run up for hurdles. You don't want to just start. We all know what happens when you just start with the hurdle right in front of you. So for this one, I use pendulum futuring. It's also a little bit inspired by the Back to the Futures trilogy. It's where we move back in time as far as we want to also move forward. So we swing, if we're futuring to 20 years from now, we swing back 20 years. And we look at the major wins, some of the huge socio-political events that might have helped us to innovate or been obstacles to those sorts of creations. We combine informed projections, synthesis, prioritizing particular information. It makes time tangible, so you can have it on a wall and stand with people and really say what happened that really mattered and what of that could we learn from for the next swing. It does integrate backcasting, so once you've got your scenario from your future, you can move back to today. And it can be used as a research tool or a collaborative consultation and discussion board, and as a visual argumentation tool. So I use this with my students quite a lot. I want to take you through 3 of the timescapes that I was using back around the 2025 mark when I was most active visualizing futures with communities. And this one was from an exhibition at Tinchhead's Gallery at Sydney University that was co-curated with Ruli Zakaria and Dallas Rogers, called Amplify. We were exploring sound in urban politics and sonic activism. And we had a 7-week public program that consisted of a pirate radio station, instrument building. We had a featuring wall. We had, it was around the time of the first attacks, the escalation of attacks on Gaza. There were calls to prayer. There were drawing sessions. There were banner painting workshops. It was a really beautiful space for activism and context-responsive creativity. One of all the three of the cues there were listening back to our past, so especially in relation to sound in protest. So what's the most memorable protest you attended or organised? When did you first engage in activism? At a key moment in radio for you. Listening ahead to our futures, what will we be listening to? What are the greatest challenges to civic participation over the next 40 years? What are the key opportunities to embrace, and what technologies will we use to share and amplify grassroots organising? And we left this up on the wall for students and people to attend the exhibition to contribute to. And there were many things in there, from people broadcasting radio into women's prisons at Christmas to Korean students talking about a 1 million-person silent march in protest of the corrupt government there at the time. And there were also many personal moments as well, and some facetious contributions. There were surely some cock and balls on there as well at different points. But it turned out to be quite a rich timescape. We haven't yet synthesized this information. Oh, God, that's 10 years ago. I really should have done that, more than that. But it was a beautiful experience and a way to sort of document the conversation that was happening there at the time as well. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, I was working with Doctors Without Borders, Illawarra Women's Health Centre, and the Royal College of Psychiatry in New Zealand and Australia to look at featuring domestic sexual and family violence to 2031, particularly in foregrounding trauma recovery. We had around 300 frontline workers who were also in lockdown, but also essential workers, obviously, running emergency response centres. And those timescapes were really looking at, they had a driving question on the end of them. This one is, what are public health responses and mechanisms that support women to recover from FDSV in 2031, and then building back from there. And it was really interesting that one of the things emerging from that workshop was a sharing of data, that they realised they weren't actually sharing data enough as one of the ways to argue for these trauma recovery centres. This was a part of the successful funding, $25 million from, I don't know if you remember that Scott Morrison guy, but he actually funded it, or sorry, his government funded it at the time. So it was an incredibly powerful campaign. I was invited to lead the regional research for Sonic Street Technologies. There's since been 4 books published between 2026 and 2030 called Mobile Music Machines, that if you don't already have copies of, definitely flag them to be bought. And we, this was led by Julian Henriquez at Goldsmiths University, and it was funded by the ERC for, I think, $2 million, mapping sound system culture around the world, connecting different crews and funding them to document their communities and their incredible innovations, as well as just the joy that brings them together and the current challenges they have with their technologies. I went all the way over to the most amazing global reggae conference that my friends at Sydney Uni thought I invented, to host a Listening to a Century of Sound, where we look back to 50 years of the significant moments and 50 years forward. And that was, people were asked to add the significant moments, also some burning future questions, and a shared challenge in the present. Some of the most ferocious Caribbean women scholars were holding the entire thing up, and I was just blown away by the readiness to offer these questions that really shape and lead the community. We digitised that board, and then did a thematic analysis of this. The reason I'm sharing this is because I think it's most pertinent to this community, of what we can do with this board if you do actually run with it. And in this analysis, the community realised that there were 3 particular themes emerging that had advocacy plans attached to them, or weight that they could throw behind particular questions. I'll share the link to the paper on this, or the blog post at least. It's not a paper. It's a very nice blog post though. So that brings me to the NIME community featuring. This is where I want a break to show up so I can catch my breath, but that'll happen at some point. My intention wasn't to share grand theories of NIME-ishness to come, but I have spent some time combining the offerings and explorations of the 2025 conference with some of the more pressing questions that have emerged during recent research and community projects, and added them to the board as provocations. And the invitation is to come away from the conference with some ways of proactively futuring NIME, what it has been and what it might be. And of course, we can come together to share ideas. We do come together to share ideas, creations, and challenges. I wanted to ask, are you already happy with the amount of intentional worlding taking place in this community? And if you are, I do beg your pardon.
I'm not. I want to do more.
You want to do more? Okay. I hope this will be useful, and it is there to be hacked as well. I've sort of set it up in a way that it can be absolutely hacked. So how can our futures talk to our pasts? I hope I've modelled some of that a little bit today. How and where are we already charting significant shifts? I love that this community of hackers, designers, humanitarians, caretakers, maintainers inform and test and egg one another on a global scale in the present. I think even in the last couple of days, that's been so real and ready and rich. But if you think of your entanglement with this community, what do you think are the 3 main threads that are always held, and why? And are these the same for you personally as for the whole group? This is a visualization of possibly the first NIME breaking away from Kai in 2001, or being adjacent to, and then moving out to a possibly visualization of 35 years of NIME-ishness between the 2000s and the 2030s. And obviously there's 35 conferences in there, I think. But if you think of these as particular moments where a braid crosses over, where threads are lost, where other particular ones come in, some of you may have felt that some conferences feel very similar, or it's very circular conversations, or you keep coming around to the same thing, or there's a whinge fest happening over here that just does not move. What of that needs a little bit of a shake-up? If we zoom into one of these, so this is zooming into, if you can remember, back to the 2025. So these hoops, if you imagine being in this moving thing with these threads that are coming and going, and not all of them are continuing, what are the new threads that are being brought in this particular year? What are we letting go of, either intentionally or being forced to, because they're very different? And what are we looking forward to? So is there things about this year that you really want to come back again to experience? In a slightly flu-ridden morning, I took all of the papers from the 2025 conference and mapped them out in that Miro board just above the timescape that I've created for you. And there are some thematic themes that are jumping out, and others that seem, maybe some of you will be offended by where your papers are linked to particular themes, but it is an active live board, so please reconnect and redirect some of these things in here as well, and also bring in the workshops and the music. I know I wasn't able to attend all of them, so yeah, please jump in and do that yourselves. Here is the NIME2025 mirror board link. It's also in the forum from the email that I think Charles sent out 2 weeks before, actually. And I know some of you have told me that you jumped in there and were at least happy that it wasn't a template board. Someone told me that yesterday. But there seems to have been some nervousness in participating before the conference, but now there does seem to be some more moving parts in there. The password, please note, it is NIME2035, not 2025. So this is the board as it looked at midday today. And we have a kind of GUI, multiple evolving modular 2035 over far to the right. I really love it if you could start there first, thinking about what's new and what's been held on to from 2025. Then moving back into the next 10 years, so the 10 years between 2025 and 35, thinking about new individual habits, the things we held on to from 2025. What are the community habits/rituals? What are the new metrics for working out what works? I have noticed that no one has offered some new metrics in there, but maybe you're having a beer with someone that you've never spoken to before at this particular NIME. It can be that simple. And what inspires us? And then through to the middle, looking back to more of our multiple experience of 2025, thinking about something that was new, strong, and emerging from this time, some structures that are dying out, or maybe should, and some old things that died out at around in the 2020 mark. And then old metrics far on the side here. But the reason this isn't necessarily, it's still kind of linear, which is problematic in some ways when we're thinking about time. I love those people who are able to think about them in many different wonky and circular shapes. But here, I guess you could think of it almost like an estuary or tides moving in and out, something being the time from the future or the past, dragging at some of these tensions and questions. I would have it in mirror animated, but still in 2035, we haven't got that function. So I really wish that to happen. There are helpful instructions and color codes there, but as I said, you're very welcome to hack. You're very welcome to add your own there. So the main cues there are the ones that I've introduced from what I've learned from this community. So the listening, the making, the being, the ownership and intelligence questions, education and skills, and events and policies. So if there's anything that sits outside of that, please throw it in there, absolutely. There's a section for local and global drivers of change. I find this really useful when you're having chats with people where if you just feel like they've got that pre-rehearsed reason that something's not working, or that the thing that they're doing isn't quite getting there, or the gig they really want, or the collaboration they want to take off isn't really happening, thinking about what the drivers of change either locally and globally are for these things can be a really nice way to move that conversation forward. I talked about pendulum futuring before. I have written about it as well if you want to know more there. But the three main questions I want to leave you with for this board are: what has been gleefully abandoned from 2025? What has been boldly launched? And what has been lovingly maintained? For example, in one of the 2035s, in this pluriversal 2035, the majority of sonic arts workers are closely working with the state emergency services internationally, setting up the arts arm, serving internally displaced communities due to extreme weather events. Intimate spectacle is the norm post-2030 pandemic. The bubble is now expanded to 30 people to allow for shared intimate concerts, where we're able to meet, make, and listen together, and musicians are considered essential workers as they are the connectors. Attention span extension therapy in response to links made between short attention span and anxiety and low performance in Western education is the norm, and composers and instrument builders are recruited in to challenge that. Super short attention spans since 2031. There is that mandated 8-minute content cap with 20-second reset to think of someone you love or admire or your favorite tree, as we've experienced today. So we really want you to go for the plausible through to the preposterous in terms of futures over the next 10 years. Sorry, the last 10 years. I got to stick with my futuring, my time stamp. Okay, so back to those questions. You could yell some of those things out now, or answer some of them in the Q&A with Pia. But just beyond these things, and also beyond just coming up and saying hello at some point, because I will be here, I'd really like you to have a look at some other futuring materials that are not very long papers. There's 2 articles in the conversation that might be useful, thinking of futuring as community activism and agency building. There's another one on pleasure activism around the repair raves in Ukraine that I think this group might be particularly interested in. A wonderful group of, I think, 20-somethings trying to protect their love of rave as well as rebuilding just communities that have been destroyed by the Russian escalation invasion. And then there is that, it's not a paper, it's a blog, but it's a glorified blog about my time in Jamaica and running the workshop there. And it also has some useful glossary definitions. And then if you do want to know more about my life in improvised music that continues to this day, there's this lovely piece by Jim Denley in Disclaimer Journal run by Liquid Architecture. But I'd love you to join me on the Miro board if you can and say hi. And I really want to say thank you so much to Pia and Charles for so enthusiastically being up for something a little odd and evolving for this. And thank you to you for being on this ride as well. I'm not sorry that I don't have any socials. I boycott Meta very happily last year, but you're very welcome to contact me in these ways. Thank you, everybody. Just in time. Done.
So we have quite a bit of time for questions, which is really great. Who would like to start us off? You might like to go to some of the questions that the probes that are cool. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Just want to say great talk. It was really delightful to experience the QR code again, as well as using the Miro board. And I'm just wondering, like, obviously that was intentional, but like, what sort of value do you see in that?
In QR code and Miro board?
In revisiting that kind of nostalgia. Technology.
I am quite nostalgic about those things. But I also think most of us ingested so much mercury with the sushi we were eating in the 2020s that we've kind of forgotten a lot of that stuff, especially the doorway QR code stuff as well. Although in the 2030 pandemic, all of that, there was the QRR code as well, which I haven't gone to because I think it's all still a bit too soon. Yeah. But I do think these platforms are reminders of technology gone by is something dear to all of our hearts. Is that more of a comment than a question? Thank you, though. You're very welcome to answer rather than question if you have particular things that you think could be left behind.
I'm a bit nervous about asking this. It's been 40 years since Erica talked about ontology.
Mm-hmm.
It seems quite related. I'm just interested to see what you think about Hallmark Fisher's idea of, lost futures, which kind of seems very related to this kind of idea of futures, which I haven't heard of.
Lost futures, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
So here's the idea that you talk about nostalgia, we talked about this idea that we've had this kind of interest in what's gone in our past in the 80s or revising these things, and we look at it as what's been lost, kind of seeing what's been lost, or ontologies, Derrida talks about it, is that there's so many moments where we might take off in different directions, but we end up on one path. But it seems to be in your future, and you're trying to be quite positive about it, is that correct?
Oh, that's a contentious one. So, yeah, I think there's future possibilities that some of us would be very happy to not go down that track, right? Like, and then I'm one of those people, I'm in therapy for this, but I tend to have like parallel possibilities, and I'm constantly thinking of what could have happened had I taken that other path, and it's almost like I'm living both of those lives. I can't comment on Derrida's work on futures and lost futures, but it definitely does seem relevant, and I will read up on it. Is there something special to you about that, or does it make you think or inhabit time in a different way?
No,
sorry.
I just worry about, when I look back, I worry about whether it's nostalgic. We like to say whether I'm looking back at the past. We hear many people like Trump or Green, the past was in some bullshit way. But I worry that I still look back and think, like, I talk tomorrow about tape, because I love all my music is made in analog tape.
Yeah.
And I can't disconnect the fact that is that because my childhood was with tape, or is it because I think it's an interesting artistic practice which will add something to the future?
Yeah, well, I think it is pretty relevant to this community as well. I've had some chats with people around, there's a lot of aspirational technologies, right? There's a lot of, in music, things that we hope would work if we had different things available to us, different energies, different processing systems, things like that. As well as there are people presenting this conference who are hacking ancient instruments, like who are revisiting the capabilities of an instrument to, I don't know if they're romanticizing it, but just enhancing, amplifying, maybe also inhabiting both parts of time, the now and the then. A lot of my futures are futures according to the 80s, I think. I still think of a silver spandex wearing, space inhabiting musician world. I just can't shake that, even though that I know it's not available to most humans. There are people paying $21 million to go up into space for 8 minutes at the moment. That's available to some people. That absolutely isn't available to me. So that future of being available, what is it, the Morris quote, the future is already here. It's not evenly distributed. I think you would all be very aware of that with some of the technologies we're seeing at this conference. Imagine if all of the musicians, composers, sound workers and artists we knew had those technologies available to them. What would that do to the urgency of developing them, the specialness of performing with them, how we connect to one another. Like, there's something about it not being available or being special or unique that makes it have its power. It's a good question.
Hi, thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I guess I was wondering a bit about this diagram that you had about like the possible versus like impossible.
Oh yeah.
Imagining futures. I really love this. And it reminds me of Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. And that is what's easier to imagine versus what's sort of like impossible versus all of these. If you're familiar with the capitalist realism thing.
I'm not, but that's added to my list as well.
It's easier to imagine dystopia than it is to imagine like a brighter future.
Yeah, no, that's true. Okay, I have heard that before.
And so I guess I'm wondering what's your approach for getting into this sort of like impossible space, because it's like getting into this the thing that would be like impossible.
So that's a great question. And with the students I work with doing this, the best thing is to make the scenarios you're building as granular as possible and as grounded as possible and as located as possible. It's almost like when you're speaking in vagaries, it's harder to be wild, strangely. So, and scanning your entire body and scanning a 24-hour period and thinking about what's possible when you're telling that story from a particular future, And then you realize, actually, I'm making all these assumptions. I'm welding using worlds that don't actually serve us now. In that scanning of the body, scanning of the 24 hours in your day. Thanks, Germ Studies. In doing that, a lot of the students will realise that they're just bringing in, the cleaning of the teeth, or the calling their mother, or the commute to work. Like, there are all these things that they drag from pasts into their futures, and anything that looks like it does today, we try and get them to flip it or amplify it or extend it. That said, the reason why Blade Runner was so effective and so impactful was that a lot of the behaviours and technologies felt really familiar, or they were familiar and just older and grimy. So there's that thing as well of, if you are going to have these extremely whack or expanded scenarios or contexts, also bringing in some of those little elements of the familiar can actually help to make it feel more tangible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you were talking about making things granular, with more with smaller things. With some of the smaller details.
Yes, and so in relation to NIME, for example, if anyone's on the board there just saying we need to connect more beyond the conference, that is a great suggestion. But like, where, how, who's going to lead that? Like, making it, like, attaching it, making it have some more accountability, or locating it or anchoring it, makes those comments more useful, or makes them more like actions rather than suggestions that float in the air. Yeah. But I think it'd be great. Like, I'll visit back in on that board in the coming weeks as well. And if people are suggesting, I don't know, they'd be suggesting research groups or papers or things like that on there, or a particular working group to make sure the cost of the next NIME conference is not doesn't lock people out, from the conversation. Like, maybe there are really, really specific things like that. That's not a dig on you.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
Okay. So the more specific the actions or the possible futures attached to particular things like that, I think the more useful a board like that can be. Yeah. But challenging each other, if you just say, oh, yeah, NIME2025, there's going to be 90% music performances and only 10% talking heads. Why? Yeah, why would you have that? Or what push each other to make it a little bit more preposterous or wild in there, challenge each other to amplify it a little bit, make it a bit weirder. Also have some things in there that you really don't want to happen, and then figure out what toolkits need to be built around that. Yeah. Yeah, why don't you want it to happen? What needs to happen in 2030 so that doesn't happen in 2035? Yeah. Thank you. Oh, there's another one.
Used to play basketball, doesn't know. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk.
Was it seated basketball?
Seemed like. It's too late throwing me off. You mentioned this romantic future or present situation where musicians are essentially essential workers. I'm interested in knowing, as a hypothetical situation, what do you think should happen, or how should the dynamic between how society values the musical labor should shift or change to achieve such a future? Because for now it seems very unattainable, unimaginable. So we're just interested in knowing how should we even regard the musical labor, how should we value it?
Yeah.
To achieve this, and if you think if that's even possible.
Do any of you in this room work in art therapy? Or have done any work in arts therapy? I feel like that's almost like the closest step to getting towards a recognition of like a broader recognition of music as, or musicians as essential workers, valued labour in society beyond. I come from a family where, being a musician or an artist at all was, I was told to get a trade. I became a graphic designer initially, and playing music was a bad habit, basically. So I'm not from a family that got behind that, and I didn't have any examples of that in my past. Oh, I'm going to get emotional about this. So yeah, I've spent my whole life trying to argue for the value, even within my family, of this work. And yeah, I think the closest thing is teaching and in arts therapy. I'm not really sure what else needs to happen more broadly. There's been some super effective propaganda in Australia, possibly early Howard era, to demonise artists as doll bludgers and as a waste and a drain on society. I don't know if that's the case for other people from other parts of the world here.
Yes.
Yeah, so I reckon a pretty concerted campaign to contest that. I guess doing what we do is contesting that, and having the impacts we have and changing lives is pretty important. But there is also a danger in arguing using the metrics of labour and the market for art, which I saw happen during the Arts Cuts with Brandis, talking about the art sector having as many people employed as the mining sector in Australia. Do you have an idea that you think could move us towards that future?
Not really. I think there's a lot of literature, but also a lot of research that I feel is a little bit detached from reality of actually doing what we do in the field, and a lot of theories around how it should be valued and paid for with the whole labor of music. All its shapes and forms, if it's writing songs, intellectual properties, or whatever. And I think a lot of them are sort of detached from reality, and I myself in perpetual search for redefining how we kind of value the act or the labor of music. And I suppose I always ask the question when I see a person like you might have a solution or an idea or something.
Yeah, I guess I've also seen great work done by unions. I'm a rank and file NTU member, but I know the MEAA and also the National Association for Visual Arts has done a lot to argue for artists as incredibly essential, valuable labour. And I wonder whether sometimes we just look at those peak bodies and unions and just say, oh, they're doing the work for us. But if you have a particular idea or you think it's actually something that's really important and would actually affect everyone's lives, then maybe that's built into NIME's new habits, where there's like a half a week each year where people jump in to try and argue for that internationally or pass on the tools for when it's worked. Yeah, I think trying to fight for these things on our own makes no sense. And there's such great work being done by someone that we could get behind and amplify. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah. Oh, wow.
G'day. How are you good? Thank you so much for all those provocations. I suppose in the spirit of talking about doing what we do, I'm very curious to hear from you how these ideas about futurity figure in your improvisational practice. Because I think so often discussions about improv, we're thinking about presence, a mediation between musics that have come before and perhaps the contingency or uncertainty of the present moment that we're performing. And so I'm really curious to hear about why you emphasize futurity as something that's important to your practice in that context.
It's again, thank you for the question. And I think it was during the PhD when I was also learning about futuring and practicing it as a community workshop kind of a thing, taking it and going, hang on, I've actually been doing this in the festivals I've organised and with the maybe the orchestras we started and the music that we play in that passing on of questions or crafting questions that we know will move. So this not this we've arrived somewhere and that's it, or this is this extremely neat polished package, but that it will absolutely move. I think featuring as well as improvisation that I absolutely love because of the radical trust that is required often to meet someone somewhere where they're at with the tools we have, is a kind of featuring of a way of being or a kind of welding. So where we do actually have this radical trust and these risks are being taken because we believe that there are these gold nuggets of creativity or explosive moments that could possibly happen. I'm also completely aware that improvisation is god awful 90% of the time, but the 10% of the time that it is incredible is worth wading through. I'm probably preaching to the converted, but yeah, it is this. I feel like it is a kind of featuring. If you are an improviser and it's something that you practice and you really believe in, and you draw other people in, it is a kind of a welding and a community making that is bringing about a future that I absolutely want for more people than the improvising musicians around me. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you in the Miro board. Yeah.